One of the things that I have a problem with sometimes is this concept of hell. How am I supposed to think of eternal torment or torture, or how can a loving God, how can a merciful God allow something like that to happen, or even like cause something like that to happen? I mean, how should I think about this?
Okay, that's a question that a lot of people wrestle with, and different Christians have come up with different answers at different age times to try to make sense. I think the first thing to say is that the word torture is not used in the Bible by the idea of eternal torture. It does talk about the idea of loss, torment, deep sorrow, and various other terms, all of which are bad.
Sorry, what is the difference between torture and torment? How would you...
Okay, so I think the torture implies, I have a knife and I'm slowly cutting into you and causing you pain. Torment can be an inner state that springs from a relational hurt. So the person you love most in this world turns their back on you. You could talk about yourself being in torment. Now, the pain is real. And as a matter of fact, someone might maybe try and argue maybe even more acute than just the physical pain of someone torturing you. But the idea is that actually it's caused through a relational heartache rather than through a physical process. And I think that can be helpful for two reasons. One, we often think about heaven and hell in geographical terms, but I think we best need to understand them in relational terms. The Christian message isn't so much, do you want to go to heaven, do you want to go to hell? Which destination do you prefer? But it's, who do you want to be with? Now, all relationships are a function of trust. So you're sat here across the table from me, believing that you can trust me in two ways. One, you think I'm not going to physically attack you, and two, that I might have something that you feel is worth saying. Now, if either of those prove to be false, or I attack you, I betray that trust, the relationship is broken. Sin, therefore, this moral violation, always destroys and breaks down relationship. That's what it looks like. So if I sin against you, even if we're very close friends and I'm unrepentant, our relationship isn't restored. Now that's how the Christians see this, coming back to the center of the gospel again, it with God. God desires to be in relationship with us. He makes forgiveness possible. He invites us into relationship with us. We can receive forgiveness from God through repenting. So one of the other acts of repentance, the way it works is, if I wrong you and you're willing to forgive me, if I genuinely say, I'm sorry, I receive your forgiveness, our relationship is restored. Yeah. You and I are now in relationship with each other. Well, that's exactly the same in terms of the Christian gospel. Okay? Sin, moral wrongdoing, things we have done break relationship. We can find ourselves in emotional torment, maybe psychological torment as a result of that. We may be oblivious to it. Okay, but it's still the same. And when we die, the fact that we're not in that relationship is carried over into the next world. We still don't have that relationship. If, however, I receive that forgiveness and I come into that relationship, when my heart physically stops beating, then that is also carried forward. And so I think it's easiest to understand about this in relational terms.
So you're saying that, we have certain images in our mind.
Yeah.
When I think of hell, I think of the devil and fire and worms that don't die. And when I think of heaven, I think of people sitting on clouds and playing the harp. And
and I don't play the harp.
Neither do I. And
maybe that's why heaven lasts forever. That's how long it takes to play.
It sounds boring. I've met people who think that heaven is really boring.
Absolutely.
And the only reason they would go to heaven is, I don't really want to go to hell. But
exactly. I think you're right. If we think about heaven and hell going on just forever, that is a very seriously long period of time. What is it that actually makes it worthwhile? If at the heart again of this is the idea of relationship, of having relationship with God and enjoying relationship with God, the Bible talks about the fact that as the deer pants for the water, so our soul longs after you. Now that's not just a longing that there is a God, a longing that he may be out there. I hope God exists. That's actually a longing born out of an existing relationship. I'm in relationship with you, I'm in love with you, and I'm just desperate to spend more time with you. Well, those things are the things that don't bore us. As a matter of fact, we can spend time just in each other's presence, just enjoying being in each other's presence, without a lot of other stuff going on. Well, that's how heaven is portrayed. Heaven is portrayed primarily in relational terms, with a being who is infinitely creative, and there's never any boredom that sets in, because it's eternally captivating. It captures all of our imagination and our creativity, and I think it's a very creative place. I think hell is the opposite of that in every kind of way. I think what can be helpful can be one Christian thinker. He put it a bit like this. He says, imagine that you have someone on earth who's sinning against themselves, they're damaging themselves, they're sinning and doing bad things to other people, they're increasingly relationally isolated. Eventually that person begins to experience hell on earth, quite literally, hell on earth. And maybe he says that's exactly what it is. And when our hearts stop beating, that state of hell that we experience, of this complete isolation and loneliness, is what we then go on to enjoy for eternity. So I think we do have this sense in which we can imagine, especially in a relational way, the consequences. And this is where I think the word torment becomes maybe more apt. If it's the case that God is offering us one thing and we're rejecting him and choosing another, then it may be that we come to a point where we are then just overwhelmed with sorrow at what we have done. And we find ourselves in that state of loneliness. Now, the thing that gives me hope is we are told that it is God's will that no one should perish and all should have eternal life. So the Christian understanding is that there is a loving God, and it is his will, his desire, that all should come to know him. But we also read that that isn't the case. That doesn't mean, therefore, that people don't enter into a relationship with him because of a lack of willingness on his side. But it may be more to do with what's going on our side.
I like what you're saying, but when I look at the Bible, I also see things like the lake of fire, or the worms that do not sleep. And how does that fit with what you're saying?
Yeah. And I think there's something else which is going on there, which is actually very important. Because these are all word pictures, what we call a metaphor. And then we have to think, well, not what the metaphor is, but what does it stand for? So I think there are two things there. One, historically, when there were very few Bibles in this world because the printing press wasn't in existence, biblical truths would often be communicated not just through preaching, but also through plays, and maybe even through pictures and pieces of art. And one of the ways of doing that was by taking those metaphors, those word pictures, and painting them in a way. And you see that with Dante, very famously with his Inferno. Now the trouble is that sometimes the artist's interpretation of that has become more primary in some people's hearts and minds than actually what the Bible has to say about it. So there is a historical thing there, but there's also something very important going on here, and I think it's helpful just to think about how the Bible uses language. If you were to say to me, look, I'm heartbroken, Michael, when you say, look, my heart is broken, I don't interpret you saying that the muscle in your body, which is your heart, isn't working properly. I interpret you saying something has gone wrong relationally and I'm really, really hurting. And that metaphor, it's a metaphorical language, it's not real, but it is a metaphor to a reality that maybe is even more descriptive than saying to me, oh, Michael, my girlfriend doesn't want to see me anymore. Now you may say that, and it may not give me very much insight. If you say, look, my girlfriend doesn't want to see me anymore, maybe you think that's a good thing. Maybe you're not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing. So that statement, the fact, the analytical statement, tells me what happened, but it doesn't give me a huge insight necessarily to what's going on. But when you look at me and say, I'm heartbroken, it's a metaphorical language. The language isn't real, but it allows me to see the reality of what's going on in your life more clearly, more precisely, and with more depth than if you chose to use non-metaphorical language. So the Bible uses metaphorical language. But it's not the metaphor we want to concentrate on. Does that make sense? The question is, a metaphor for what? A door to what? What is the reality it opens up? And I think what the language that the Bible is using there all the way through is, look, talks about wheeling and gnashing of teeth, for example, on that, the final day of judgment. All of that language seems to say, look, we may think being with God is the boring option and going to hell is the interesting option. The opposite is the case. You may think that the most fun and creativity and freedom you could have would be here, in hell as opposed to heaven. The opposite is the case. You may think you'll be glad that you don't have to spend eternity with God. Well, the opposite is the case. Okay? You will miss that, with an intensity of feeling that you find hard to imagine. So I think I think all of that language is metaphorical, but it is a metaphor to something which is real. And it's the reality that I'm interested about. And that's why I say I find the word torment and the nature of the relational description which is given to us to be the best thing lying behind that metaphor. Sadly, in most of us have experience in human life of messing up a relationship or missing out on a relationship that we didn't think was important until we lost it. And then in light of its loss, we suddenly realize how important it was. We were taking it for granted or we were ignoring it when we shouldn't have done. And now, with hindsight, we look back and regret and think, oh. And there's an instructive thing there. And I think the Bible's using that kind of language to say, look, don't create that kind of scenario for yourself. Don't create that kind of setting for yourself. Don't miss out on the thing which may ultimately prove to be of ultimate value, ultimate worth, ultimate importance. Okay? The single greatest thing. So I think the language is very stark because I think the choices are huge. So, and I think we sometimes read the Bible, we can take things out of context and think, well, gosh, that's very harsh. But again, I sometimes use the example of saying, if you have a blind person walking towards a cliff and you say to them, ooh, stop, you're going to hurt yourself, and they just push you aside and say, go away. You may then say to them, look, another 8 paces, you're going to fall 250 meters on, there are sharp rocks down there, you're going to be shredded to little pieces, the tide's going to carry you out to sea and the fish are going to eat what remains. Now, if the person turned to you at that point and said, stop threatening me, you would say, this isn't a threat. This is a promise. I'm saying if you don't stop going, this is what will happen. Stop. And you will use increasingly strong and maybe colorful pictorial language so that even though they cannot physically see, they can begin to understand something that you're trying to communicate to them and why it's so important. And I think that's also what's going on with the Bible as well. There may not necessarily be literal physical realities, but it's saying, look, this is what it will feel like. This is what it will be like. Stop. Don't go that way. Go this way.
So it seems that you're not talking about hell as if it were a punishment in that sense.
Oh, no, I think it can be a punishment, but I think it can be when I say self-fulfilling one, I want to use that word very, very carefully. The Bible does talk about that we will reap what we sow. And so there is a sense in which we can understand a part of what's happening with heaven and hell as, well, we will reap partly what we have sown. The problem is we make it exactly what we asked for. But it may be that which we asked for wasn't what we needed or what we should have wanted at all. And we're now having to live with the reality of it. Now, I think there is an element of punishment in there too. So coming back to the conversation about the cross, we do have this sense of that justice will ultimately be upheld. Either all sin is dealt with by God himself on the cross, or if we refuse that, then we too have to pay the price for that which we have done wrong. But I think the main aspect of heaven and hell isn't just simply paying the price for that which we have done. We've only committed a finite amount of sin and a limited number of them. Jesus himself said in John chapter 3, very famously, for God sent his Son into the world that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. But then it goes on to say, for whoever believes in him, for God did not send his Son, into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. Now that's interesting. But then it also goes on to say, Jesus goes on to say, but whoever does not believe in him stands condemned already because he hasn't believed in God's one and only Son. So let me try and put this in a picture for you. Let's supposing someone says, look, I didn't choose to be born into this world. That's true. I didn't choose to be born into this mess. That's also true. I didn't choose to come into this completely broken, mixed up, crazy place. That's true. So they'll say, look, it's like I've been born into this raging sea of sin, and I'm drowning in it, and I can't swim. And I'm thrashing about in the water, I'm trying to get out, but I don't know how to swim, and I drown. And then God comes and punishes me for drowning. How's that fair? And the answer is, it's not fair. There's no fairness in that at all. But let's suppose you're in the sea and you're drowning. And someone comes along and says, hey, look, take my hand, I'll pull you out. And the person says, no, if I get out, I'll do it my own way. I'll do it on my own. And the guy in the boat says, you're crazy, you can't swim. Look, just take my hand, I'll pull you out. And the guy says, no, I won't. And then he drowns. Now, does that change the picture? Well, it does change the picture. What Jesus is saying in John chapter 3 is, you will not be condemned for the sea. That isn't your fault. We live in a broken world where other people have done bad things to you and things around you. It's not your fault, and you're caught up in it. But God has reached out his hand in the person of Jesus Christ for a rescue, and it's the only way out. And there is no other way out. And if you don't take his hand, Jesus says, if you do not take my way out, then you will be judged for that, because you refused the only way out of this broken mess. Now that means that Jesus is putting himself now in a very elevated place. He's making himself the standard of ultimate judgment, okay? Which isn't normally what most prophets would do, or indeed religious instructors like Buddha or anyone else. They don't normally make themselves the standard and the means of salvation. They normally come to announce some other type of salvation and advocates someone else's standard. Jesus says, look, I am the standard by which you'll be judged, and I am the means of salvation. Both of those are found in me. And take this way out. It's the only, it's the only way out of this mess that you're in. And I think I find that again very humbling. I think the idea that God is saying, look, you're not responsible for everything. We're not, is reassuring. But the idea that I'm responsible for something does shine the spotlight again. And then the fact about, look, am I willing to take a provision that he has made, in which I'm basically saying, look, I can't do this. I can't swim out of this on my own. Should have a humbling effect. And it also explains, I think, why we talk about loving God, because if someone has saved your life, you can't help but fall in love with them. And it's not the fact that you have to do things for them. You want to, because you love them. That's who they are.